The first time I realized the forest could hear me, it was because my breath came back wrong, slower than I'd exhaled it, colder, as if something else had borrowed it before returning it to my lungs. My name is Aaron Cole. I was 39 when this began, and I had already spent most of my adult life in a green uniform that smelled like sap and wet canvas. I worked as a federal forest ranger in the Northern Rockies, assigned to a stretch of land locals still called by an older name, one that never made it onto official maps. Pines packed so tightly together they swallowed sound. Limestone ridges honeycombed with caves that predated any record we kept. A place where radio signals bent, where compasses argued with themselves, where people disappeared and were quietly explained away. I was good at my job. That mattered to me more than I admitted. I believed in procedure, in checklists and trail reports, in the idea that anything could be understood if you approached it with enough patience and light. The locals knew me. Not in a friendly way, not exactly, but they knew my truck and they knew I didn't exaggerate. When something went missing, a hunter overdue, a teenager who wandered off a trail, I was the one they expected to bring clarity, if not answers. The forest taught me early that clarity is a privilege, not a right. It started with sounds. That's how it always starts, though no one ever believes you when you say that. They want footprints, broken branches, something that fits inside a photograph. But sound is the first thing that goes wrong out there. It loses its shape, carries too far or not far enough. I was on a routine patrol in late October, the kind of cold that tightens your jaw without warning. The radio crackled with a half message from dispatch. Something about a camper who hadn't checked out. I remember thinking how ordinary it felt. How welcome, even. A task with edges. The campsite sat near the base of a ridge locals avoided after dark. They said the caves up there breathed. Said fog rolled out of their mouths like a living thing. I'd written that off as inherited language, stories passed down until they sounded like memory. Still, I parked farther back than I needed to and walked in. The fire pit was cold, tent gone, no trash, no gear, just a ring of stones and the smell of pine resin crushed under boots. What caught my attention wasn't what was there, it was what wasn't. No animal tracks, no sign of departure. The ground looked brushed clean. That was when I heard it. A low sound, not quite a growl, not quite wind. It came from upslope, from the trees leaning toward the ridge. It carried weight, like something massive shifting its balance. My first thought was bear. My second was that bears don't pace like that. They move with purpose, or they move with hunger. This sound did neither. I called out, my voice steady because I needed it to be. Ranger protocol, announce presence, let wildlife know where you are. My words fell flat, absorbed by needles and bark. The sound answered again, closer, then stopped. I stood there longer than I should have, listening, telling myself that unease is not evidence, that fear is an evolutionary trick, a false positive meant to keep you alive. The forest, I reminded myself, is full of tricks. On my way back to the truck, I noticed something etched into the dirt near the tree line. A series of parallel lines, too deep for claws, too wide for fingers. They ran for several yards and vanished into leaf litter. I photographed them, logged them, filed them under unknown disturbance. I slept poorly that night, waking with the sense that I'd forgotten something essential. Over the next weeks, the calls increased. Hikers reporting voices where there should have been none. Campers describing heavy footsteps circling their sites but never approaching. A group of college students swore something mimicked one of them from the trees, repeating a laugh until it broke into something else entirely. I told myself, people hear what they expect to hear. The human mind fills silence with meaning. That's not denial, it's training. You can't do this job if you let every story burrow into you. Then the caves came up again. An older man from the nearby town stopped me outside the station one morning. He didn't introduce himself, just looked at the patch on my shoulder and said, "It's awake." I asked what was awake. He shook his head like I'd missed something obvious. "Doesn't matter what you call it, matters where it sleeps." He pointed toward the ridge. That night, I pulled the old reports. Yellowed incident logs, handwritten notes scanned and forgotten, references to missing livestock, to search teams that quit early without explanation. One account described a silhouette taller than the trees at the cave mouth, its outline wrong, its movement hesitant, like it was remembering how to stand. I laughed once, out loud. Then I stopped because laughter echoed too easily in an empty office. My first direct encounter happened in early December, during a snowfall thick enough to erase your past in minutes. A distress call came in from a backcountry trailhead. Static heavy, someone crying. I went alone because backup was an hour out and the voice on the radio sounded small. The trail climbed fast. Snow muffled my steps, turned the world intimate and claustrophobic. Halfway up, the crying stopped, replaced by something rhythmic, breathing maybe, too slow, too deep. I rounded a bend and saw tracks crossing the trail, enormous, bare. Each step sunk so deep it reached the frozen soil beneath. I knelt despite myself, touched the edge of one impression. It was warm. The smell hit me next. Wet fur and minerals like stones struck by lightning. I stood, heart loud in my ears, and that was when the trees ahead shifted, not swaying, parting. It stepped into view with the reluctance of something unused to being seen, taller than any man I'd known. Broad, sloped shoulders matted with pale hair darkened by meltwater. Its face was partially obscured, but the eyes, those I saw clearly. Not animal, not human. Something old, carrying the weight of watching. We stared at each other, the snow falling between us like a curtain neither of us could cross. I waited for panic. It didn't come. What came instead was a terrible recognition. The sense that I was not prey, but trespass. It made a sound then, the same sound I'd heard weeks earlier. Not a threat, a warning. I don't remember deciding to back away. I just did, slowly, respectfully. The way you leave a room when you realize the conversation was never meant for you. I made it back to the truck with frost on my lashes and a certainty I could no longer file away. I told no one what I'd seen. I wrote up the incident as wildlife disturbance unidentified. Procedure. Denial. Wearing a uniform, but the forest had marked me. I felt it in the way the trees leaned closer when I walked, in the way the caves exhaled fog that smelled faintly of fir and stone. In my dreams, I stood at the mouth of the ridge while something vast shifted in the dark below, waiting for me to remember why it had let me leave. And even then, especially then, I told myself I was still in control. Control is a fragile thing. It doesn't shatter all at once. It thins quietly like ice warming under snow until one day you step forward and realize there was never anything solid beneath you at all. After that night on the ridge, I became meticulous in ways that bordered on obsessive. I double-checked trail closures. I rerouted patrols away from the cave system under the pretense of rockfall risk. I logged weather patterns that didn't align, noted animal migrations that bent strangely around one section of forest as if the land itself were diseased. I told myself this was professionalism, risk mitigation. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was afraid of meeting those eyes again, afraid of what recognition might demand the second time. The locals noticed the change before my colleagues did. People who've lived near wilderness long enough develop a sensitivity you can't train into yourself. They asked fewer questions. They lingered longer when they spoke to me, watching my face for slips. One woman, whose family had trapped those woods for generations, pressed a small carved token into my palm one afternoon. Bone, smoothed by handling, a spiral etched into it. "For when the ground listens," she said, and left before I could respond. I kept it in my pocket. I told myself it was superstition. I never threw it away. Winter deepened. Snow piled high enough to swallow trail markers. Sound grew sharper, cleaner. Every footstep felt amplified, every breath a signal flare. That was when the disappearances started to feel personal. A volunteer ranger failed to check in after a boundary survey near the ridge. His last transmission cut off mid-sentence. I replayed it dozens of times, searching for something obvious. There was nothing. No scream, no struggle. Just a pause, and then a low, resonant sound so faint it could have been interference. if I hadn't heard it before. We mounted a search. Protocol demanded it. 6 of us on snowshoes, moving in a line that felt suddenly ceremonial. The forest watched. I don't know how else to say that. Branches creaked without wind. Snow slid from limbs in deliberate cascades. We found his pack near the cave entrance, neatly placed against a rock like an offering. No blood, no drag marks, just deep impressions leading into the dark. No one volunteered to go in. No one had to say why. I should have ordered it. That was my role. Instead, I stood there staring at the black mouth of the earth and felt a pressure behind my eyes that had nothing to do with cold. The cave breathed out a fog that curled around our boots, carrying that same mineral scent. Wet fur, stone, memory. We marked the location, withdrew, and filed a report that used words like hazardous terrain and presumed fall. The volunteer's family accepted it with the numb grace of people who knew better than to argue with mountains. That night, I dreamed of walking underground, not through tunnels, but through a space that felt carved out of something living. The walls pulsed faintly, like veins under skin. I could hear movement ahead of me, heavy, patient. When I woke, my sheets were damp, and the spiral token was clenched so tightly in my hand it had left an imprint. Denial is a powerful drug. It keeps you functional. It lets you lace your boots and drink your coffee and tell yourself that fear is just another weather pattern to be monitored and endured. But it also erodes trust, first in others, then in yourself. I began to doubt my instincts. Every time unease prickled at the back of my neck, I forced myself to rationalize it away. Sound travels strangely in snow. Shadows stretch. Stress manifests physically. I said these things so often they became a mantra. Still, my body didn't listen. My pulse spiked without warning. My hands shook when I passed the ridge road, even in daylight. The next encounter broke something open that I couldn't close again. It happened during a welfare check on an old fire lookout scheduled for decommissioning. No one had staffed it in years, but a light had been spotted there after dusk, steady, not flickering like a campfire. I went alone. I told myself it was because the access road was narrow and the weather unpredictable. I didn't want witnesses. The climb was long and exposed. Wind scoured the ridge, carrying with it a sound that threaded itself through my thoughts. Not the warning call this time. Something closer to speech. Broken syllables stitched together without meaning. I reached the lookout just as the light went out. Inside, the air was stale, untouched. No footprints. No heat. The bulb above the desk was cold to the touch. As I turned to leave, I saw the window fog over from the outside, a massive shape blotting out the stars. A hand, if that's what it was, pressed against the glass. 5 long impressions, too many joints. It leaned down until its face was level with mine. The glass between us hummed softly, vibrating with a frequency I felt in my teeth. The eyes were closer now, reflective, curious. And beneath that curiosity, something like disappointment. The sound it made was unmistakable. My name, or something close enough that the difference felt intentional. I staggered back, heart slamming against my ribs, and the lookout shuddered as if the mountain itself had shifted its weight. Snow cascaded from the roof. I bolted, didn't look back, ran until my lungs burned and the world narrowed to the next step, the next breath. I made it to the truck and sat there shaking, forehead against the steering wheel, the radio hissing with empty channels. Panic crested and broke, leaving behind a raw, shaking clarity. This wasn't a random animal. This wasn't a trick of stress or isolation. It knew me. It had been watching, learning, waiting. Escape doesn't always mean leaving a place. Sometimes it means abandoning the version of yourself that believed you were immune. I requested a transfer, cited burnout, exposure. The paperwork moved slowly, caught in administrative loops. In the meantime, I avoided the ridge. I stuck to lower elevations, populated trails. The forest let me, or so I thought. One evening, as I locked up the station, I found deep impressions in the snow by my truck, bare, familiar. They circled once, then headed back toward the trees. In the driver's seat, I found the spiral token placed carefully on the dashboard. A message, clear as any warning call. I didn't sleep at home after that. I stayed in the bunkhouse, lights on, radio close. I replayed every encounter, every choice. I realized slowly, painfully, that my greatest mistake hadn't been fear. It had been arrogance, the belief that understanding was optional, that respect could be deferred. The forest doesn't punish, it responds. And something in the caves had decided I was part of its story now. Once you understand that you've been chosen, not marked for death, not hunted but included, the fear changes shape. It stops being sharp and becomes heavy. It settles into your bones. You carry it the way you carry altitude sickness or grief, quietly, because making noise won't help. My transfer was approved 2 weeks later. Another forest, another district. Paper said I had 30 days to clear out. The forest, however, had its own timeline. The first night after the spiral appeared in my truck, I heard footsteps outside the bunkhouse sometime after midnight. Slow. Deliberate. Not the crunch and scrape of deer or elk. These steps had cadence. Weight shifted heel to toe. Whoever or whatever was walking understood balance. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths the way I'd learned to do on search and rescue calls when panic threatened to take my hands. The footsteps circled once, twice, then stopped directly outside my door. There was no knock. Instead, there was that sound again, low, resonant, felt more than heard. It vibrated through the walls, through the metal bed frame, into my teeth. My name came again, clearer this time, not spoken so much as shaped, the way wind shapes snowdrifts. I didn't answer. I don't know what would have happened if I had, but every instinct I had left screamed that response was consent. Eventually, the pressure eased. The steps retreated. Dawn came pale and brittle, and I went outside to find the snow around the bunkhouse smoothed flat as if brushed by a massive hand. No tracks leading away. After that, my resistance shifted. Denial had failed. Rationalization collapsed. What took its place was something more dangerous. The belief that if I learned enough, if I understood the rules, I might survive intact. I went back to the caves. Not officially, not on any map. I took a day marked as leave, parked miles away, and approached on foot through terrain so rough no one would stumble into it by accident. The forest grew denser the closer I got. Pines knitting together overhead until daylight filtered down in thin, anemic strands. Sound dampened. My own breathing felt intrusive. The cave mouth yawned open like it had been waiting. I stood there a long time before stepping inside, my headlamp cutting a narrow cone through the dark. The walls were smoother than I expected, worn not just by water but by passage. Old passage, frequent passage. The air was warmer underground, damp, alive with echoes that didn't quite match my movements. Every step I took felt like it arrived somewhere else before it reached my ears. I found markings on the walls deeper in, not scratches, not claw marks, symbols maybe, spirals, variations on the same shape as the token, carved with care into stone too hard for any tool I knew. Some were fresh, others worn almost flat by time or touch. The realization settled slowly, terribly. This place wasn't a lair. It was a threshold. Something moved in the dark ahead of me. I killed the headlamp on instinct, plunging myself into total blackness. My heart hammered so loud I was sure it gave me away. The sound approached, then stopped just beyond my reach. I felt watched, assessed, measured. When the light came back on, the passage was empty, but the floor bore new impressions. Bare feet, massive, pressed deep into mud that had been undisturbed moments before. Facing me. I backed out the way I'd come, never turning my back fully, my skin crawling with the certainty that I was being allowed to leave again. That allowance felt conditional. From that day on, the forest felt crowded. Even on clear trails, I sensed proximity. Trees leaned in, shadows lingered a fraction too long. The caves appeared in my dreams with increasing clarity, not as places of fear, but as repositories. Libraries. I dreamed of bones arranged carefully, of stories etched into rock and flesh alike. The panic came next, sudden and unmanageable. It hit during a routine patrol near a family campground miles from the ridge, children laughing, campfires crackling, normalcy like a held breath. I heard the warning sound roll through the trees, low and unmistakable, and watched as birds lifted en masse, fleeing in a dark wave. I ran, not toward the campground, away from it, intercepting the direction of the sound with a clarity born of terror. I broke into a clearing and saw it standing at the edge of the trees, taller than before, or maybe just closer. It watched the distant lights of the campground with an intensity that chilled me. I realized then what my true fear was. Not for myself, for everyone else. It turned its head toward me, eyes catching the last light of day. The disappointment I'd sensed before was sharper now, accusatory. I understood, in a way that bypassed language, that my presence was a disruption, that my efforts to categorize, to explain away, had drawn attention where there had been equilibrium. I raised my hands, not in surrender, in acknowledgement. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice breaking the quiet. "I won't come back." The forest held its breath. It stepped back into the trees, melting into shadow with a grace that felt ancient. The sound faded. The birds did not return. I stood there shaking until night fully claimed the clearing, then went back and evacuated the campground under the guise of a weather warning. People grumbled. They always do. No one was hurt. My last weeks passed in a blur. Paperwork, farewells that felt hollow. I packed my things and drove away under a sky heavy with snow, never looking back toward the ridge. I work a desk job now. Training. Policy. I sleep with the lights off again. Mostly. But sometimes when winter comes and the air turns sharp and mineral, I hear that sound outside my apartment window. Not a warning. A reminder. I keep the spiral token in a drawer. I don't touch it often. I've learned that some connections don't need maintenance to persist. The forest didn't follow me. It didn't need to. It taught me what it needed to teach. That reason is not a shield. That protection is a relationship, not a role. And that some stories are buried not because they are false, but because they are still alive, breathing quietly beneath the pines, waiting for someone else to forget that the ground is listening. I thought leaving would seal it. Distance has a way of convincing you that whatever followed you was only ever a shadow cast by the place itself. New routines helped. Fluorescent lights, key cards, meetings where people argued about policy language as if words alone could fence in the wild. But the forest doesn't exist only where the trees stand. It exists in the mind of anyone who has listened long enough. The first year away, I avoided thinking about it. I told the stories the way people expect them to be told, vaguely, cautiously, with enough distance to make them safe. I said the woods demand respect. I said people disappear because nature is unforgiving. All of it was true, and none of it was complete. What I didn't say was that I had started to notice patterns. Every report that crossed my desk involving unexplained events, missing hikers, strange sounds, sudden evacuations, shared subtle similarities, remote areas, cave systems nearby, witnesses describing the same internal conflict before things went wrong, the moment they ignored instinct in favor of reason or trusted routine over unease. And always, the land responded. I began to understand something I wish I never had. That thing in the forest, the one people would reduce to a single word if they ever dared speak of it openly, was not an invader. It was not a monster wandering into human territory. It was a keeper. A pressure valve, a presence that enforced boundaries long before we pretended those boundaries didn't exist. The caves were not hiding places. They were vaults. I returned once, not to my old forest, not directly. I attended a conference hosted near another national park, one known for its limestone caverns and a history of lost time incidents the official brochures avoided mentioning. I told myself it was coincidence, professional curiosity. The night before my presentation, I couldn't sleep. The air felt wrong, too still, too attentive. I walked outside the lodge and stood at the edge of the tree line, snow crunching under my boots. That was when I felt it again. Not presence, not pursuit, recognition. No sound came this time, no footsteps. But the pressure built behind my eyes the same way it had on the ridge years before. Images surfaced uninvited, spirals carved into stone, breath-fogging cave air, eyes reflecting starlight, not as threat but as record. I understood then what had been expected of me all along. not silence, witness. I went back inside and rewrote my presentation from scratch. I removed the charts, the sanitized language. I spoke instead about humility, about the limits of control, about how survival in wild places depends less on dominance than on listening. I didn't mention caves, I didn't mention what watches from them, but some people in that room understood anyway. I saw it in the way they didn't ask questions afterward, in the way they nodded once, slowly, like people who had been waiting for permission to trust what they already knew. That night I dreamed of the forest one last time. I stood at the cave mouth, but this time I didn't feel small. The dark inside wasn't empty. It was full, layered with stories older than fear. The presence moved past me, not toward, carrying something heavy and unseen deeper underground, guarding it, preserving it. When I woke, the sense of pressure was gone, replaced by something like grief or gratitude. I still can't tell which. Now, years later, I tell this story because it's time. Not as a warning meant to scare people away from the woods, but as a reminder that awe and terror share a border, that the wilderness does not exist for our comfort and never promised safety in exchange for curiosity. If you walk among the pines long enough, you may feel it. The subtle shift when the forest becomes aware of you, when sound tightens, when instinct whispers something reason can't translate. Listen then, not because something is hunting you, but because something is deciding whether you belong. The caves are still there, the spirals are still being carved, and the stories locals whisper aren't myths meant to entertain children. They're instructions passed down in fragments, shaped by fear, because fear is memorable. I was a ranger once, a protector, I thought, confident in maps and training and the idea that light solves everything. What I learned instead is this: some darkness is not meant to be chased away. Some is structural, necessary, holding up the weight of everything above of it. Respect that, and the forest may let you pass. Forget it, and you may become another quiet space on a map, another name explained away, and another story someone tells in a lowered voice when the fire burns low and the trees lean in close enough to listen. I used to believe the forest was indifferent. That was the lie I carried into this job, the one that made the uniform feel lighter and the radio less like a tether. Indifference is comforting. Indifference means the land doesn't care whether you live or die. It means you can disappear without being noticed. I know now that belief was wrong. The forest noticed me the first time I failed someone. It has been saying my name ever since. I have been a federal ranger for 17 years. Law enforcement, search and rescue, wildfire response, those are the categories they put us in, as if the work stays inside neat boxes. I took the job because I wanted quiet. I wanted something solid and procedural after my brother vanished in a place that did not leave tracks. People assume you choose wilderness work because you love nature. That's not always true. Some of us choose it because we're trying to outrun a memory, and the woods are big enough to swallow almost anything. The first years were uneventful in the way only government work can be. Lost hikers, drunk campers, the occasional body recovered too late to matter. Paperwork, radios hissing with half sentences. I learned the terrain like a language, where sound carries, where it dies, where snow preserves, and where it erases. I learned the difference between silence and absence. Silence is active. Absence is a void. The forest is rarely absent. The incident that started this did not announce itself. No alarms, no screaming, just a call that came through just before dusk, thin with static. A solo hiker overdue near a decommissioned spur road that hadn't been used since the mines shut down decades ago. The coordinates were old, handwritten, translated twice before they reached my dispatch. The kind of call that usually ends with a tired apology and a sheepish hiker emerging from the trees. I took it alone. That was my first mistake. Not because I broke protocol, we do solo recon all the time, but because the forest prefers witnesses to be isolated. The road was a scar through the trees, half reclaimed. Moss crept over rusted culverts. The air smelled wrong for evening, metallic like a storm that never arrived. As I walked, the temperature rose in slow waves, heat pressing against my throat even though the forecast called for frost. My breath came shallow. I told myself it was nerves, dehydration, the long week. I found the pack before I found the person. It was upright against a pine, clean in a way that didn't fit. No dirt on the straps, no scuffs. Inside were a phone with no signal and a camera with a cracked lens. The last photo showed trees, too many trees. The perspective was wrong, tilted upward as if taken from the ground while someone stood over the camera. I zoomed in until the pixels broke. Between the trunks, something reflected light that shouldn't have been there, a shape that matched nothing in my training manuals. I called it in. Static answered. Then a voice that sounded like mine said my call sign back to me, perfectly. Same cadence, same breath. The hair on my arms lifted. I checked the radio twice, switched channels, spoke again. Silence. When the radio came back, it was my supervisor, annoyed, asking why I was repeating myself. I marked the location and began a grid search. That's when the ground started to vibrate. Not a tremor, more like a low hum, felt through the soles, up the bones. It stopped when I stopped. When I moved, it moved. I thought of generators, old mining equipment buried and still alive. That thought kept me functional. As darkness settled, the forest changed its sound. Birds went quiet too fast. Insects stopped mid-note. Then came the whispering. Not words at first. Friction sounds, like breath pushed through teeth. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the soil itself. I knelt, pressed my hand to the ground, and felt warmth radiating up, wrong and steady, as if something vast was sleeping just beneath the surface. I should have pulled back then. I didn't. Guilt has momentum. Once it starts, it carries you past the places where stopping would be reasonable. I kept thinking of my brother, of the day we told ourselves he knew the area and would be fine. I kept thinking that if I turned back now, I would be doing it again. I found footprints near a stand of dead birch. They circled. Not aimless. Deliberate, as if someone had walked in a tightening spiral over and over until the ground gave up and let them through. At the center was a depression, smooth and dark. It smelled like burnt hair and wet fur. I felt a pressure on my chest there, invisible and firm, pushing me down until my knees buckled. When I looked up, there was a figure between the trees, standing too still. Human-shaped. Wrong proportions. It did not move when I raised my light. Its shadow did. I blinked, and it was gone. The pressure lifted. The forest exhaled. I stood there longer than I want to admit, telling myself it was a trick of light, exhaustion, the mind making patterns where there were none. Rationality is a habit. It can be hard to break. The search escalated the next morning. Teams came in. Dogs refused to work. Radios failed in pockets. One of the volunteers said she heard her mother calling her from uphill, even though her mother had been dead for 10 years. We logged it as stress. We always do. The official report says we found nothing beyond the pack and signs of animal activity inconsistent with any known species. That phrasing was not mine. They pulled me off the case after I insisted on extending the search into an area marked as restricted on maps that predated my birth. The markers were old military stock, half buried, numbers scratched out. A sealed entrance yawned behind a screen of vines, concrete sweating in the heat. I remember standing there, hand on the cold surface, feeling vibrations on the other side, like something shifting its weight. That night, I dreamed I was underground. The walls breathed. Metal whispered. Voices called my name with my brother's voice with my own. When I woke, my boots were muddy with a red-brown clay that did not exist anywhere above ground. I have not been the same since. The forest has a way of following you home. It settles into your lungs. It waits. I am recording this now because the vibrations have started again, and this time they are under my floorboards. If you are listening to this, you should know that some searches are meant to fail. Some disappearances are not accidents, and some places remember the people who noticed them. The vibrations did not stop after that night. They changed character, like a sound you learn to ignore until it shifts pitch and suddenly demands attention. At work, I felt it through the concrete floors of the ranger station. a subtle pulsing that rattled the loose pens in my desk drawer. At home, it came up through the bed frame, steady enough to sync with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell which was which. I stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. When I did drift off, I dreamed of corridors that sloped downward without end, walls sweating condensation that tasted metallic when it hit my lips. I told no one. That was not professionalism. It was fear. I had already been quietly sidelined once. Another report, another insistence on something I couldn't prove, and they would have taken my badge for my own good. Instead, I buried myself in routine. Patrols, trail maintenance, permit checks. The forest, meanwhile, kept rearranging itself around me. Paths I had walked 100 times felt longer, narrower. Trees leaned closer together, bark splitting in patterns that looked like writing if you stared too long. I learned to stop staring. The second disappearance happened 6 months later, late summer, during a heat wave that turned the understory into a sauna. A seasonal ranger named Cole failed to check in after a routine boundary patrol near an abandoned town site, one of those places that barely exists on maps anymore, a name and a dot surrounded by nothing. I knew the area. I had avoided it since the first incident without admitting that was what I was doing. They sent me anyway. Experience matters, they said. Familiarity. I took a partner this time, a deputy from the county sheriff's office who joked too much and chewed sunflower seeds until his jaw clicked. He asked about the rumors. People always do. I told him there were none worth repeating. We found Cole's truck where the road dissolved into ruts and weeds. The engine was cold. The doors were open. Inside, the air was thick with a sweet, rotting smell that didn't belong. On the dash sat Cole's radio, still on, whispering. Not static, breathing, slow, wet. I reached to turn it off and felt a shock, not electrical but physical. A jolt up my arm that made my fingers go numb. The deputy laughed it off, said it was probably a short. He didn't hear the voice under the breathing, repeating a phrase I recognized too late as my own reassurance, something I'd said to a lost kid years ago. We followed footprints into the trees. They were crisp despite the dust, as if pressed into damp soil that wasn't there. Every few yards, the prints changed shape, toes blurring, heels stretching. The deputy slowed, then stopped. He said he could smell snow. I told him it was impossible. It was 98 degrees, sweat ran into my eyes. And yet, there it was, a clean, sharp, cold scent that cut through the heat and made my teeth ache. The ghost town emerged gradually, structures sagging out of the green, a general store with no roof, a church missing its bell. The ground vibrated more strongly here by enough to set the loose boards humming. We split up to cover more ground. I regret that decision with a clarity that hasn't faded. I found the mine entrance behind the church, hidden by collapsed timbers and blackberry vines. It was marked on no current map. A warning sign lay face down, the paint blistered away. When I pulled it free, the metal was warm, almost hot, despite the shade. The air coming from the opening was cold enough to fog my glasses. It smelled of wet stone and something else, blood diluted by running water. I called for the deputy. My voice echoed wrong, too many returns, as if the sound were being caught and thrown back from angles that didn't exist. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, relief flaring. It was Cole, or something wearing him. His uniform was intact, clean, but his face was slack, eyes unfocused, mouth moving without sound. When he spoke, it was with my brother's voice, asking me why I hadn't come sooner. I don't remember drawing my weapon. I remember lowering it, because the thing in front of me smiled when I did. The smile was a fraction too slow, like a bad connection catching up. It stepped backward into the mine, inviting. The vibrations intensified, rattling my teeth. From deeper inside came a chorus of whispers, layered and urgent. The deputy screamed somewhere to my left. The sound cut off abruptly, like a cord pulled free. I ran toward it, heart pounding, lungs burning with air that felt too thick to move. I found his hat on the ground, crushed, warm. No blood, no tracks leading away, just a series of impressions that sank straight down, as if the earth had opened and closed again. Backup arrived hours later. The official story says the deputy fell into an unmarked shaft and that Cole's disappearance remains unexplained. The mine entrance was sealed within days. Concrete poured until the ground stilled. They told me to take leave. Mandatory. Compassionate. I didn't argue. At home, the whispers grew louder. They came from the walls, from the pipes, from the spaces between thoughts. Sometimes they were nonsense. Sometimes they were instructions. I started finding red-brown clay in my sink, under my nails, despite not leaving the house. I woke one morning with the taste of metal in my mouth and the certainty that I had been underground again. I began to research. Old maps, declassified documents. There were references to a project that never officially existed, tunnels driven too deep, something found that resisted removal, accounts of workers who walked out and were never the same, of towns that emptied without explanation, patterns that overlapped with my cases in ways that made my hands shake. The forest, it seemed, was not just land. It was a cover, a skin stretched thin over something patient and aware, something that learned our voices, our shapes, our reassurances, and used them. I went back to the sealed mine alone at night, driven by a need I couldn't name. The concrete was cracked, oozing warmth. As I touched it, the vibrations surged, and from beneath the surface came my name, spoken with perfect familiarity. The concrete gave way with a sound like a sigh, not a crack or a shatter, more like something long held finally being released. I should have run. Instead, I pressed my forehead to the opening and listened. The vibrations resolved into a rhythm I recognized with a sick lurch of memory. The cadence of speech slowed beyond comprehension, syllables stretched until they became pressure rather than sound. I squeezed through the gap. The temperature dropped instantly, cold enough to raise gooseflesh through my uniform despite the heat outside. My light cut a narrow tunnel through darkness that seemed to drink it in. The walls were not stone in the way I expected. They were layered, striated like muscle fiber, damp and faintly warm to the touch. I told myself it was mineral deposits, optical illusion. I told myself a lot of things down there. The passage sloped gently downward, then split. Old rail tracks disappeared into both branches, metal eaten thin by rust. The air smelled of sulfur and decay, undercut by something clean and sharp that made my eyes water. Every few steps, the ground trembled, a living response to my movement. I felt watched from angles my light couldn't reach. When I stopped, the watching intensified, a weight pressing against the back of my skull. I heard my supervisor's voice ahead, clear and authoritative, calling for a status update. I almost answered before I caught myself. The rational part of my mind cataloged the impossibility. He was states away, the radio dead. Another voice layered over his, then another. A crowd forming out of the dark. Some were people I had worked with, some were not. One was my brother, laughing softly, the way he did when he thought I was overreacting. I followed the voices because the alternative was to stand still and feel the walls inch closer. The tunnel opened into a chamber so large my light couldn't find the ceiling. The floor was covered in a thin sheen of water that reflected shapes that didn't correspond to anything above it. When I moved, the reflections moved differently, lagging, sometimes stepping ahead. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that should not have been there, a bunker door, military grade, set into the earth at a crooked angle. Its surface was etched with marks that looked like writing until you tried to read them. As I approached, the smell intensified, blood in snow, the memory of cold layered over heat. My chest tightened. Invisible pressure bore down, pinning me in place. From behind the door came the whispers, now coherent enough to understand. They were rehearsing, practicing tones, testing phrases. I recognized things I had said in the past. Comfort offered to the lost, commands barked under stress. They were learning us. I forced the door open with a strength born of panic. The hinges screamed. Inside was a corridor lined with metal walls that hummed with vibration. Frost coated the surfaces despite the warmth radiating from the floor. The corridor sloped downward, steeper than before, and at the bottom waited a room filled with equipment that looked decades out of place. Reels of cable, broken monitors, a desk with papers fused into a single mass by moisture and time. On the far wall, a series of photographs had been pinned: rangers, miners, locals, my brother, me. The photos of me were recent, taken from angles I couldn't recall anyone standing. Beneath each was a date and a set of coordinates that matched disappearances I knew too well. Some had been crossed out, some had not. The whispers rose to a roar. Shapes moved in my peripheral vision, silhouettes peeling away from the walls. They stood motionless, watching, learning. One stepped forward, skin rippling as it adjusted, features settling into a near-perfect copy of my face. It spoke with my voice, steady and calm, telling me everything would be fine if I just stayed. I fired. The sound was swallowed. The thing didn't fall. It softened, collapsing inward like wet cloth, then flowed back into the floor. The vibrations peaked, pain lancing through my head. I realized then that this place was not a lair or a nest. It was an interface, a listening post. The land itself, shaped and taught by us, by our machines and our secrets, had learned how to answer back. I ran. The corridors shifted, branching where none had been, sealing behind me. Heat blasted from vents that hadn't been there moments before, followed by pockets of killing cold. Something brushed my ankle, unseen, and I stumbled, hands scraping against metal that left my palms bleeding. The blood steamed when it hit the floor. I emerged hours later through a fissure miles from where I had entered, dawn breaking over a landscape that looked unchanged. Rescue teams found me wandering, dehydrated, raving. The official report cites a stress-induced break. The mine, they say, does not exist. The town site was bulldozed decades ago. The photographs were dismissed as hallucinations. I know better. The vibrations are back, stronger now, synchronized with my pulse. Sometimes, when the radio crackles at work, I hear my own voice calling for help from places I have never been. I have started to catch my reflection doing things I didn't initiate, smiling when I am not. I am recording this as a warning, not because I think it will stop what's coming, but because the land likes to be acknowledged. It remembers every scream, every reassurance, every name. If you hear someone calling to you from a place that shouldn't exist, do not answer. It already knows your voice. I had been a ranger for nearly a decade by then, old enough to trust my judgment, young enough to believe experience made me immune. 38 years old, raised by loggers and volunteer firemen, I wore the badge the way some men wear a wedding ring, with commitment, pride, and a quiet belief that it meant protection went both ways. My post sat deep in the northern Rockies, a stretch of national forest locals still called by its older name, one that never made it onto maps anymore. Pines crowded together there like a congregation that never slept. Even during the day, the light arrived tired, filtered through needles and time. People imagine this job as trails and sunsets, lost hikers grateful to be found, the occasional citation for an illegal fire ring. They don't imagine the silence after midnight when radios crackle with nothing and the forest breathes in a way that doesn't match the weather report. They don't imagine how loneliness sharpens perception, how it turns every snapped twig into a sentence waiting to be finished. That night began like dozens before it. A routine patrol, an aging truck humming beneath me, headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the trees. The locals had been restless all week. A trapper swore something had taken 2 elk without eating them. A seasonal worker quit mid-shift, left his boots by the bunkhouse door, and drove south without saying goodbye. When I asked him why, his hands shook so badly he couldn't get the key into the ignition. He just said, "It knows the trails better than we do." I logged it as stress. People break in the woods. I had broken once myself, years earlier, after a recovery that ended in a tarp zipped too fast. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to keep moving. The wind died around mile marker 12, not faded, stopped. The truck's engine sounded suddenly obscene, like a cough in a church. I shut it off and listened. No insects, no birds settling. Even the creek to my left seemed to hold its breath. I stepped out, boots crunching on frost, and the cold felt deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me. I remember thinking of my father then, how he taught me to read the woods the way some men read faces. If it goes quiet all at once, he used to say, something's listening. I told myself that was superstition, the kind men pass down with their tools. Still, my hand rested on the radio longer than it needed to. The smell came next. Not rot, not smoke, something musky and damp like wet fur left too long in a cellar. It carried weight. It settled in the back of my throat. I followed it without deciding to. Flashlight beam trembling across trunks scarred by old lightning strikes. That's when I saw the prints. They were wrong. Too large, too deep for the crusted snow, pressed in a pattern that suggested balance rather than haste. 5 toes, no claw marks. I crouched, gloved fingers hovering just above the edge of one impression, and felt a prickle of embarrassment at the thought forming in my head. We all know the stories. You hear them in ranger bars, whispered like confessions after the second drink, hair-covered silhouettes, calls that echo without bouncing. I pushed the thought away. Bears walk upright sometimes. Men do strange things in the woods. A sound answered me from deeper in the timber, low and resonant, like breath drawn through a long chest. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a call. It was closer to a statement. My flashlight flickered. I slapped it once hard, as if discipline could restore order. The beam steadied, caught on a shape between the trees, too tall to be a stump, too still to be an animal I knew how to name. Denial is a mercy. It gives you a few extra seconds to function. I told myself it was shadow and distance conspiring against me. I told myself I'd been working too many nights. When the shape shifted, when weight transferred from one leg to another with a patience that suggested intelligence, denial cracked. I did not run. That's the detail I hold on to when I replay it. I stood my ground, radio in hand, voice steady as I reported an unidentified large mammal near the service road. Procedure matters when your thoughts start to fray. The response came back delayed, distorted by terrain. Copy, someone said, like they were underwater. The smell intensified. My eyes watered. The shape stepped forward and moonlight brushed a shoulder broad enough to block stars. I could not see its face, only the suggestion of a head tilted slightly, as if curious. The forest did not resume its noise. It watched with us. When it moved again, it did so with economy, crossing ground without sound. Panic arrived late, a hot surge that blurred my vision and made my heartbeat feel loud enough to give me away. I backed toward the truck, counting steps, refusing to turn my back. My heel struck metal. The door handle was cold, familiar. I fumbled, got it open, and slid inside, slamming it shut with a sound that felt disrespectful in that quiet. The engine turned over on the second try. As the headlights flared, the shape dissolved into the trees, not retreating so much as redistributing itself. I drove until my hands stopped shaking, until the radio filled with static that sounded almost like laughter if you listened wrong. I filed my report at dawn, careful with my language. Large bipedal animal, unusual behavior, no direct threat. My supervisor raised an eyebrow but signed off. We are trained to stay within lines. Outside them, things get complicated. The days that followed brought no relief. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I smelled wet fur and cold. Locals avoided my gaze. One old woman at the general store pressed a bundle of pine needles into my hand and told me to keep them by my bed. They don't like being remembered, she said. I smiled politely and paid for my coffee. The second incident happened near the old limestone cave the maps marked as closed due to instability. I had always hated that place. Sound behaved badly there. Your own footsteps came back wrong, delayed, as if someone else were following at a careful distance. We used it for training once years ago until a recruit panicked and bolted, claiming the walls were breathing. A hiker went missing on a Tuesday. 22, solo, experienced. His last text mentioned the cave, curiosity couched as confidence. Search protocol demanded we include it. I volunteered before anyone could stop me, driven by a need I didn't examine too closely. If I faced it on my terms, maybe it would shrink back into a story. Inside, the air was colder than outside, damp with minerals and age. My headlamp cut a narrow path through darkness that felt textured, almost resistant. Every drip echoed like a footstep. I moved slowly, cataloging marks on the walls. Scratches too high to be from climbing gear, smears that caught the light and refused to explain themselves. The sound came again, closer this time, reverberating in a way that made direction meaningless. My chest tightened. I thought of the missing hiker's mother, of the way hope sounds over the phone when it's trying not to be fear. I pushed deeper, rationalizing each step as duty. That's when I found the backpack. Torn straps. Mud ground into the fabric with a force that suggested anger or play. No blood. The absence felt intentional. As I reached for it, something exhaled behind me, warm and close enough to fog the back of my neck. I froze. In that moment, reason finally failed me, not in a rush, but like a door closing softly, irrevocably. I understood then that the forest wasn't just a setting, it was a keeper, and it had been watching me learn how small my rules really were. I did not turn around. That choice felt instinctive, older than training, older than language. Whatever stood behind me had already closed the distance in a way that mocked pursuit or evasion. Turning would not give me information I could use. It would only confirm what my body already knew. The exhale came again, slower this time, carrying that same wet, animal musk I'd smelled weeks earlier by the service road. My headlamp flickered, not dying, just dimming as if the darkness itself were leaning closer. Somewhere deeper in the cave, water dripped steadily, the only sound still obeying the rules I understood. I spoke without planning to. My voice sounded wrong in that space, flattened, stripped of authority. I said my name. I said I was there to help. I said things people say when they want the universe to remember they are human. The words dissolved before they reached the walls. A hand, if it was a hand, brushed the air near my shoulder. I did not feel pressure, only displacement, the way you sense a large object pass close in the dark. Panic surged then, sharp and chemical. I bolted forward, boots slipping on damp stone, pack snagging on a low outcropping. I tore free, skin ripping under my jacket, and ran until the tunnel widened and light reappeared like forgiveness. I did not stop running when I reached daylight. I ran until my lungs burned, and the forest noise rushed back all at once, birds exploding from branches, insects resuming their negotiations. The cave entrance sat behind me, innocent and unmoving, a dark mouth that gave nothing away. We never found the hiker. The official conclusion cited terrain hazards and exposure. I signed the paperwork with a hand that still shook. At night, I dreamed of breath on my neck and woke tasting minerals and fear. I tried to regain control the way men like me always do, by doubling down on routine. More patrols, more reports, less sleep. I convinced myself vigilance could substitute for understanding. But the forest began to push back in smaller ways, more intimate ways. Radios lost signal in places they never had before. Trail cameras captured blurs that triggered motion sensors without resolving into animals. Footprints appeared near campsites overnight, circling tents without approaching, as if counting. The locals noticed. They stopped camping near the river. They warned their children away from certain stands of pine, naming them the way you name storms, with respect and resignation. One man, a seasonal guide I'd known for years, pulled me aside and asked if I'd angered something. I laughed it off too quickly. He didn't smile back. The third encounter wasn't dramatic at first. It unfolded over days, a pressure rather than an event. A family failed to return from a weekend trip. Parents and a teenage daughter, experienced, prepared. Their campsite sat near a meadow I'd always found peaceful, a place where elk grazed at dusk and the light went gold and honest. When we arrived, everything was intact, tent zipped, food stored properly, no signs of struggle, just absence. As we searched, I felt watched in a way that went beyond paranoia. My thoughts felt loud, exposed. Every time I considered a direction, doubt rose unbidden. I began second-guessing instincts that had served me for years. That erosion frightened me more than any sound in the dark. If I couldn't trust myself, what was left? Near the tree line, I found marks in the soil, Drag marks this time, shallow but deliberate, leading away from the meadow toward denser timber. My team hesitated. One of them, younger, asked if we should wait for backup. I saw my own fear reflected in his face and hated myself for it. I told them to fan out, to keep comms open. I followed the marks alone. They led me to another cave entrance, smaller than the first, half hidden by brush. I stood there longer than necessary, arguing with myself. Going in felt like capitulation. Staying out felt like cowardice. In the end, obligation won, as it always had. Inside, the air was warmer than expected, thick with a smell that made my stomach turn. The floor bore scuffs and impressions overlapping in a way that suggested repetition, ritual. I called out, my voice steadier now, not because I was calmer, but because fear had settled into something colder and more focused. The response came from deeper within, not a sound this time, but movement. Shadows shifted against my headlamp beam in ways that broke geometry. I caught glimpses, a limb bending where it shouldn't, a suggestion of fur matted with earth. And beneath it all, a sense of recognition as if this place remembered me. I realized then that the encounters were not random. They were cumulative. The forest was teaching me something, stripping away my assumptions layer by layer. Protector, authority, observer. Each role peeled off until all that remained was a man alone in the dark, measured and found wanting. I backed out slowly, every nerve screaming, and made it to the entrance without incident. Outside, dusk had settled. The meadow lay quiet, untouched. My radio crackled to life with voices calling my name, relief and tension tangled together. I answered, my voice hoarse, and told them to regroup. We never found the family either. After that, I requested a transfer. Officially, it was burnout. Unofficially, it was surrender. The forest did not object. My last patrol ended without incident, a courtesy I didn't deserve. As I drove away, I passed mile marker 12. The wind stirred the trees, then fell silent. I did not stop. Years have passed. I work a desk now, training new rangers, teaching them protocols and procedures that still matter, even if they are not enough. Sometimes they ask about the old forest, about the stories locals whisper. I choose my words carefully. I tell them to trust their instincts, but also to respect the places that do not need us. At night, when the world is quiet in a way that feels too intentional, I smell pine and damp fir. I remember caves that breathe and forests that listen. And I understand, finally, that some guardianship is an illusion, that the wild does not need protection from us, but we may need protection from what it keeps hidden, waiting patiently among the pines for someone else to forget how small they are. I thought distance would dull it. I thought concrete walls and fluorescent lights would overwrite pine needles and limestone dust. That was my final mistake, believing fear obeys geography. The first year away, the dreams intensified. Not louder, not more violent, clearer. In sleep, I was back in that forest, but not as a ranger. I moved without weight, without resistance, watching myself from angles no human body could hold. I saw patrol routes traced like veins. I saw campsites glow faintly, each one a small warmth against a vast, patient cold. And I saw the caves, not as holes in the earth, but as nodes, connected by something older than stone. The forest wasn't haunted. It was organized. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. My wife noticed before I did. She said I listened too hard when the house settled at night, that my eyes tracked shadows that weren't moving. I told her it was habit. You don't turn vigilance off like a switch. She accepted that answer because it was easier than asking what vigilance was for. During training sessions, I caught myself drifting. A recruit would ask about lost person behavior, and I'd see that meadow again, untouched and accusing. Another would ask about animal encounters, and my mouth would dry as I remembered breath on my neck in the dark. I stuck to the manual. I avoided anecdotes. Stories give things shape, and shape invites memory. The call that broke the illusion of safety came from a forest 2 states away. Different terrain, different history, same undertone. A superintendent I trusted asked if I'd consult on a string of unexplained disappearances near a karst system recently reopened to hikers. The word cave sat between us like a dare. I said no twice. The third time, I didn't answer at all. That night, the dreams changed. I wasn't observing anymore. I was being guided. Paths unfolded ahead of me, inevitable, lit from within by a dull mineral glow. I woke with the certainty that avoidance had become participation, that by refusing to look, I was still being counted. I agreed to go. The new forest was younger, louder, full of hardwoods that snapped and groaned even in mild wind, but beneath that noise lay the same quiet intelligence. Locals spoke carefully. They used phrases like the old hollows and places you don't linger. A search and rescue volunteer told me the woods felt tilted lately, like gravity had opinions. We stood at the cave entrance just after dawn, tourists milled behind tape, unaware of the calculus happening in my chest. The limestone mouth yawned wide and welcoming, signage cheerful and wrong. I smelled it immediately, that damp animal note layered with stone. Recognition flared, hot and unwanted. Inside, the acoustics betrayed us. Footsteps returned, altered. Voices arrived late. I felt that familiar pressure, the sense of being assessed. We found evidence quickly. A dropped flashlight, scuffed rock, a handprint smeared too high to be accidental. The team grew quiet. No one joked. Instincts don't require consensus. Deeper in, the tunnel narrowed, forcing single file. I volunteered for point. Control is easier when you're first. The air warmed as before, thickening with that breath scent. My chest tightened, not with panic this time, but with something like grief. I understood then that what I felt wasn't just fear. It was familiarity. The sound came from ahead, a low resonance that bypassed the ears and settled directly behind the eyes. One of the team members whispered my name. I didn't answer. I was counting steps, grounding myself in numbers because names felt dangerous. We rounded a bend and the tunnel opened into a chamber so large our lights failed to find its ceiling. In the center, the floor was worn smooth in a wide oval, as if something heavy had paced there for a very long time. Along the walls, scratches overlapped in layers, recording time without dates. And at the far end, half in shadow, something shifted its weight. I saw it fully then, not as a myth, not as a trick of light. It stood taller than any man, shoulders sloped with muscle and age, fur matted and streaked with mineral white. Its face was not monstrous. That was the worst part. The eyes were deep-set, reflective, ancient with attention. It looked at us the way you look at weather, aware, unconcerned with permission. No one screamed. Fear had matured past that. One of the younger rangers sobbed once, sharp and involuntary. The thing tilted its head, mirroring the gesture from my first encounter years earlier. Recognition passed between us like a current. I understood then why I had been allowed to leave before. I had been marked, not chosen. It stepped closer. The ground vibrated subtly, a reminder of scale. My radio hissed to life. Useless. I raised a hand, not in threat, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. The creature paused. Its breath rolled over us, warm and damp, carrying the layered sense of forest and stone and something indefinably old. Images pressed into my mind without words, caves branching like roots, forests rising and falling, humans arriving late and loud. Guardianship reframed. Not protection, but curation. We were not prey. We were variables. It turned away first, moved into shadow with an economy that mocked our fear. The pressure lifted. Sound rushed back, disordered and loud. Someone retched. Someone else laughed hysterically. I stood very still until my legs remembered how to function. We withdrew without argument. Outside, daylight felt thin, unreliable. Official reports reduced the encounter to geological instability and mass hysteria. No one challenged that narrative. Survival teaches discretion. I did not return home the same. Something in me had settled like sediment. The dreams slowed, then stopped. In their place came a waking awareness, a sense of boundaries I could feel but not see. I no longer hike recreationally. I choose campsites with care. I listen when the forest goes quiet. When trainees ask now about the edge cases, the unexplainable moments, I don't dismiss them. I tell them the truth as cleanly as I can manage, that the wild is not empty, and it is not ours. That reason is a tool, not a shield. And that some places remember who pays attention. The pines still whisper. They always have. The difference is now I know they're not telling stories for us. They're keeping records.